Welcome everybody back to Popular Music Books in Process, a co-production of the Pop Conference, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and IASPM US. I'm Eric Weisbard, one of the co-organizers, along with four others, Carl Wilson, Gus Stadler, Kimberly Mack, and Francesca Royster, who'll be handling the Q&A in a little while. We save all of our sessions on my YouTube site. So if you missed our last one, for example, with Steve Waxman and Simon Frith, head on over there if you feel like it. And in 2 weeks, our next gathering brings Mike Arrico in to talk about music, lyrics, and life, a field guide for the advancing songwriter. But today's all about Shanté Paradigm Smalls and their book, Hip Hop Heresies, Queer Aesthetics in New York City. So Shanté will be in conversation with Elliott Powell, and let me just give you some biographical information about both before we get things underway. Shanté Paradigm Smalls is a scholar, artist, and writer focused on Black popular culture and music, film, visual art, genre fiction, and other aesthetic forms. Dr. Smalls is currently an associate professor of Black Studies in the Department of English and faculty in the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Institute. Also founding co-director of the LGBTQ+ Center at St. John's University in New York City, and more specifically Queens, if I remember correctly. And I'm told that there are details about the construction of that center that are not for public consumption, but are being brooded even as we speak. So how awesome is that? From the ground up. Smalls has held fellowships from, too many places to name, received PhD in performance studies from Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. They are a series editor of Critical Race, Indigeneity, and Relationality at Temple University Press. And there's even more on Dr. Smalls' website, shantéparadigm.com. And that brings me to our second person in the conversation, Elliott Powell, Beverly and Richard Fink Professor in Liberal Arts and Associate Professor of American Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota. His work sits at the intersections of race, sexuality, and popular music. The author of the recently IASPM US prize-winning Sounds from the Other Side, Afro-South Asian Collaborations in Black Popular Music. That prize was called the Woody Guthrie Book Prize, and congratulations. Currently at work on 2 new book projects. The first is entitled Prince, Porn, and Public Space, examines the intertwined worlds of music and sex in Minneapolis during the 1980s. Second project, tentatively titled Illegitimate Sounds, Queerness, and the Politics of Inaudibility in Black Popular Music, a work considering the queer potentiality of illegibility in funk, soul, and rap music. Work can be found in many journals, and I was honored to pass the torch to him, and he replaced me as co-editor of the Journal of Popular Music Studies. 2 fantastic people. We're so thrilled to have you both with us today in the series. Our standard format, Shanté and Elliott will have a conversation together. During that conversation, we encourage those in attendance to use the chat actively, put comments, which we'll share with the presenters after the fact, questions, so Francesca knows who to call on. And as always, we urge Elliott and Shanté not to look at the chat. Don't go there. Stay away from chat. All right, that is pat on to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Thanks so much, Eric. So like, if you don't mind me starting, Shanté, I said this before we started recording, but like I said, I want to say this on record about what a pleasure it was to read this book, how field defining this book is for hip hop studies, for queer hip hop studies. It's just incredible. And I learned so much. And for those who don't know, Shanté and I we've known each other for a very long time, since we were grad students at NYU, Shanté
Yes.
being in performance studies and me in terms of me, sort of, so being in terms of me being in like American studies. And I don't know if you remember the first time we met, Shanté?
It was at the LGBT Center at NYU.
That's exactly what it was.
What were we were talking to undergrads about being gay or something?
Pretty much. That's that's kind of what was going on. But I mean, it was about that, but it was also about queer hip hop. Like there was a conversation that we were having about queer hip hop. It was more about you were having a conversation. I just kind of showed up, and we ended up just talking and hanging out after that.
That's right. And talking about our projects, because we both were working on Black Asian diaspora. Yeah,
that's exactly it. So like, these are and to see all of these things kind of come together, and your project and my project is just for me like a really kind of beautiful thing. So I'm just super excited to just be in conversation with you about this amazing book. For those who don't have it, this is what it looks like. It's a fantastic cover, which we can talk about later on. I mean, I like I said, I have a number of questions that I just want to kind of ask you to just kind of talk with me about and talk with everyone about.
Sure.
The first question is I think a very common question, but like, tell us about the kind of background of this book, where it's coming from, how you became interested in this topic, those kinds of things.
Yeah. I don't think I'll ever get tired of this question. So thank you. I mean, the most, okay, one of the dogs is being insane, but the most sort of like basic or direct connection was that this was my dissertation project at NYU Performance Studies, although the framework was different. This was a heavily psychoanalytic project, in a Freudian Lacanian psychoanalytic project in graduate school, and that really only remained in the Jean Grey chapter, which makes sense. But before that, the reason I came to graduate school was I was a performer, and I was making music. I mean, I've been performing my whole life. I come from a family of performers. And I was doing hip hop at one point in the early 2000s, late 90s. And I was like I thought I was this pioneer. And then I began to meet all of these other LGBTQ and ally hip hop artists from first across the US, and then across North America, and then across the world. And I was really curious about what was this? And some people knew each other and some people didn't. And that later became codified in a documentary called Pick Up the Mic, which came out in 2005. But I was very interested then in where these artists came from in terms of not just as individual artists. That's pretty, I want to be an MC, I want to be a DJ, I want to be a, break dancer. That's, but it was like, how are they finding each other, and why were they marketing themselves or noting themselves as a part of a queer hip hop movement? And like, what was that all about? And so I was like in the nonprofit world, and I wanted to kind of make a transition and have there be more synergy between what I was doing in terms of being a poet and a singer and an MC, and like my career trajectory. It was like I would go and like do these, whatever trainings, and then at night I would, change into my hip hop outfit. So people made some recommendations, and at first I, got my master's degree at NYU, and then ended up going to performance studies, and was like kind of blown away by the many lenses that were available to me, lenses and resources to think about. I was thinking more like, more didactically, like, gay Black people, we're here, we're gonna force hip hop to like, but it became much more sophisticated, and I learned so much. And so the project really came both from my own artistry and a desire to kind of archive in another form this trajectory. And along the way, I found very early out queer people doing rapping, and then DJing, doing other things. And so it wasn't just a knowledge that many people have or say, oh, we know there, but like putting names and faces and dates and music and that kind of thing to into print. And, the book was really hard to write. It was really hard to write, and there were many stops, and then, COVID came, but it came out, and so the timing feels really perfect. I'm really happy it's out now. And yeah, that's kind of the genesis of the genealogy of the book.
And I'm glad that you ended on this point around sort of genealogies, because that actually goes into my next kind of question, right? Is that what you do really brilliantly is showcasing really this long history of queer hip hop. And the way that you kind of think about both queerness and hip hop are perhaps might be somewhat surprising to some readers. And I'm saying this to say, you're not simply thinking about rap music, right? The way in which you think about hip hop, you're dealing with film, you're thinking about graffiti, right? You're thinking about the elements of hip hop, right? And it's far too often, right? Rap music and hip hop get sort of conflated. And you're like, well, no, if we're going to talk about queer hip hop, then we need to talk about queer hip hop in its kind of totality. And then also how you're thinking about queerness is also, I think, really important in terms of, and this goes to my question, one of the surprising things that folks might actually sort of be surprised with. I was also surprised that you, in this book about queer hip hop in New York City, you start on two chapters, one being on Martin Wong, a graffiti artist and visual artist, and then talking about Last Dragon. And so there's this moment for me as a reader, but also just as a scholar who does Afro-Asian studies, charting this history of queer hip hop, to start the first full chapter on an Asian American artist, and then to move into Last Dragon and thinking about the queer Afro-Asian kinds of relationalities that exist in the film like that, was really eye-opening for me and really important, I think. And so I want to, so it's a kind of a two-part question. One is, how intentional was it to start with Martin Wong and then going to Last Dragon and then going to the other chapters? And then the second question is kind of talking more about the organization of the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think the kind of idiosyncratic chapter order, it was part of my queer method. I mean, in some ways it followed, not exactly, but it followed, the Jean Grey chapter is the oldest. That was the first chapter I finished in my dissertation. And it's the one I really struggled with in terms of writing the dissertation, and I've worked on the longest. It was the first article that I published. So, but I wanted to start with Martin Wong, partly because I was like, oh, he's the earliest kind of figure, right, in some ways. And I was interested in kind of disrupting this idea of linearity, right? At the same time, it was really tricky because it was like, I'm not saying that hip hop culture is not Black culture at all, but I'm kind of showing a different moment and a different time. I mean, music and kind of hip hop arts is so different now. I mean, it's an industry, but it's so different. Really, it still is to an extent, but it was so much about relationships. And Martin Wong kind of demonstrated this moment in New York City arts culture where you moved to New York, he came from San Francisco, you moved to New York, you moved into a neighborhood, you met up with some kids, you got beat up, which he did a lot. He fought back, and he could hold his own. And then they're like, okay, you're cool, right? So the Lower East Side and the East Village of the 70s was like, I don't know, there's not even, it was burnt out buildings. It was squatting. It was a lot of famous artists we know now who were not famous then. And so I wanted to kind of show this moment that has really disappeared and maybe to never be seen again, where it was really built on this kind of, neighborhood relations and it's this sort of like, making it story. I came to New York and I made it, the stories you hear about Madonna coming to, on a bus from Detroit with whatever, $60. So like, you can't do that anymore. But so that was part of it. I wanted to, and I also building in a little bit of suspense, you know, in terms of like people, I assume would, you know, think that a chapter on like queer or LGBTQ rap would be first, but I really wanted to end with that. So yeah, there was a lot of thought and there was some fighting about, you know, and I was like, I know what I want to do. And if it fails, it fails. But this is how I really want to organize this, like the topography of the book and the geography of the book is really taking people through these kind of circuitous routes. I think that's really, really important. So yeah, it was definitely intentional. And then, you know, in terms of, you know how it is when you've written a book and you read through it and you're like, does this make sense? Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, it doesn't. And I really, when I read it and when I was kind of putting it together, it felt like, I felt like each chapter had a character, you know? So Martin Wong, Leroy Green, Jean Grey, and then really the main character of kind of the queer hip hop chapter is really Man Parrish. So I was like, though these were about broader movements and about broader artistic forms, I really also was thinking about trying to tell a little bit of the stories of these fictional or real people. Yeah.
No, and I mean, so one, I'll just say like, it was completely successful. The way that the book is organized just works. And the reason why I wanted to kind of bring up the first full chapter being on Martin Wong is in part starting with someone like Martin Wong, I feel is its own kind of queering of queer hip hop, right? Because as you already said, you're already expecting, all right, this is going to be a book about queer hip hop in New York City, and I'm going to get, I don't know who, right? Some, like, I was thinking about the article that you wrote in one of the Oxford handbooks, right? About kind of queer hip hop history, right? And that's not necessarily what happens, right? Instead, you take us to this Asian American, again, to the visual artist, and it's like, wait, what's happening now? And you show why Martin Wong was so important to hip hop as a queer person, the kinds of relationships, the Afro-Asian, the Afro-Latinx, right? That was, sorry, the kind of Afro-Asian and the Asian kind of Latinx kinds of connections. And then the Afro-Latinx kind of connections as well. It's really kind of beautifully written that really highlights a kind of heterogeneity around queerness and around queer hip hop that I think just works so beautifully. And so like, it's just, for me, phenomenal.
Thank you. I mean, I do think that there's, you know, I think a lot about popular culture. I think a lot about how it gets remembered, particularly and passed on, particularly, you know, teaching. I teach a class on hip hop aesthetics, and seeing and hearing what my students know, not in terms of like name that song from 1986, but in terms of what is their kind of genealogy. And some of them have parents who, and even grandparents who are hip hop heads, right? So I've had one student last year say, oh, my favorite group is Tribe Called Quest. I was like, I don't think you were born when they broke up. And she was like, they are my favorite band. And I was like, you're right, they're amazing. And then some are like, oh yeah, my mom used to listen to Lauryn Hill, but she doesn't listen to hip hop anymore. And so it's interesting to think about, you know, well, y'all get this very like slender snippet of what hip hop could be. And it's like dance, and it's visual culture, and it's, you know, museums now. And it's all, and it's, you know, for me, it was all encompassing, right? It was everything. It was house parties and learning how to DJ. And so I wanted to bring some of that riotous messiness, you know, before, you know, this is all before SoundScan. This is all before, you know, we have so many, you know, we're counting units and we know exactly this goes in that genre and that goes in. And so that was, I think, really important to disorient people a little bit, disorient expectations. And because when I encountered Martin Wong in an archive, I was completely disoriented, you know, and it kind of opened up my mind to all of this hip hop history in New York, in this case, that was hidden, you know, or unspoken, or not widely known. Yeah.
And I mean, this goes even more into another kind of question. Both hearing you talk about your students and the kind of sort of hip hop aesthetic class, like reminds me of in my Prince class, right? I always ask students the first day or at least the first week, why they're interested in taking the class. And, 90% are taking it because their parents are friends. Their parents are fans of Prince. I wish that they were friends with Prince.
Friends of Prince.
That would make a lot of my job easier for this next book, but that's not the case. But it's one of those things where it's like, wow. And it's, but one of the interesting things, as you kind of mentioned, is that when we dig into Prince's discography, then they're like, oh, I didn't even know about this song. Or like, without fail, whenever I teach like Dirty Mind, students are like, wait, students are like, my parents love Prince, but they didn't tell me about this Prince. Right?
They're like, I don't know about that. And then you like play the Batman suite and they're like, what?
And so it's just like all of that, right? We do the Scandalous suite, we do everything.
Ooh,
and it's this whole, hey, listen, conversation for another day. But we could talk about the Scandalous suite for a very long time. But hearing, there's a lot of resonances there. But also, as you are, you've written this book about queer hip hop in New York, you teach in New York. I want you to talk a little bit about why sort of New York is so key here, right? And I say this because, especially now, when we kind of talk about hip hop, we always talk about the origins in New York, but there's a way in which I think region and place seem to be less relevant in conversations around hip hop, and especially around conversations when it deals with queer hip hop. It's more focused around the artist versus the region. Yes. And so, but you're very clear in the introduction and throughout the book about why it matters to talk about queer hip hop in a place like New York City. So could you speak a little bit more about why that is and why you felt it was so important to have that?
I think the regional differences and the regional kind of perspectives are actually so important. And I know a lot of people, across whatever age groups or whatever, eschew that or don't think about that. But, I think about Regina Bradley's book that's about the hip hop South, but really about Atlanta and Outkast and the Dungeon Family. And, Midwestern, rap and Southern rap are, particularly rap from the South has really been prominent more or less for the last 15 or so years, and Midwest. And so, and you still have, of course, New York and West Coast rappers, but I think there are very particular, traditions, aesthetics, fashion, language. And I think a lot of times in Black popular culture or in Black culture in general, Black folks in the US, African Americans, I guess you could say, I hate using that term, but we get flattened. And there are really specific, there are differences, forgive me in advance, any Black person who's from the West Coast, but a friend of mine out there, we were talking about West Coast Blacks. And we were like, what is wrong with the Black people on the West Coast? Like, why, it's very different. It's a different kind of interpersonal, interrelational, kind of like communal thing. There's a very different feeling. And then of course, so we got into a conversation with a number of people on, maybe it was Twitter or something. We were talking about, someone was asking how many of y'all went south for the summer when you were kids? How many of y'all was sent south? And I was like, oh yeah, sometimes they sent you south if you were bad, and sometimes they just sent you south, to see your family. And so the things that I learned by traveling between New York and North Carolina, in my case, and also the music that traveled. So when friends would come up from North Carolina, they would bring tapes and we would bring down tapes, friends and family who would come from the Caribbean, they would bring music. And so I think there is, we can say, oh, everyone goes, on the radio or on YouTube or whatever. but there are these regional differences that help us get to, or I wanted to get to some micro scenes, you know, that weren't just broad strokes, but really get, you know, even into neighborhoods, right? Even into, you know, streets. And, you know, thinking about Wong and Pinero's Attorney Street, you know, and you, if you go by Attorney Street, you know, now it's very different, it's super gentrified, but, or thinking about Jean Grey's, locations in the Spit Until They Shame You video. Well, even though she didn't make that video, but, you know, even in a lot of her videos, you know, she's doing things in Prospect Park or whatever in Bushwick. And so thinking about the location and how, and, you know, New Yorkers, we will tell you how different Brooklyn is from the Bronx, is from Queens, is from Manhattan, is from Staten Island. So those regional, dialectical differences are really important, and and I think it adds to the richness of hip hop studies, of going deep rather than going broad, and there's then more to discover, right? There's just a lot more to talk about, and so that to me feels very important. That's part of my analysis. I'm always like, okay, where's this person from? Okay, that's interesting. Who are they connected to musically, sonically? Okay, that's interesting. What are their further influences? Okay, that, what kind of, and that is part of my training, both as a listener and also as a scholar. And I think that that's valuable for people who are going to read this, maybe in 10 or 20 years. And it's also, I feel very strongly about slowing down, there's so much rich history in Black music cultures, and Black music cultures produce their own kind of aesthetics, right? They produce fashion, or they influence fashion, they influence visuals, they influence language, or, it's like a kind of a Mobius strip. And so there's a lot to say about, all those kinds of things. Anyway, I'm going on and on and on. Hold on one second. I just need to move the dog. The dog has chewed up a yogurt container.
Okay. I'll fill up time by even more kind of sort of praising the book. And I actually really loved how you kind of talked about going deep versus going broad. I think that's I wrote that down. I'm going to be like thinking about that for like the foreseeable future. Also about slowing down, right? This is another kind of thing, as we all know, like we're in this pressure environment to just produce all these things, but like to actually slow down, take stock in some things. And I'm blanking on the name of the scholar, and I know that they have a book coming out later on this year, but they wrote something about Black queer parties and slowness and slowing down. And I'm blanking.
Kemi?
Yes, Kemi. Yes, exactly. So like this notion around slowness as a particular kind of Black queer aesthetic might act like there's something there, obviously. And so just to hear you kind of say that made me think about Kemi's work.
Well, can I just say this? So for instance, I was walking down the street yesterday, and someone was playing slow motion. Hey, I like it like that. Working that back, don't know how to act slow motion for me. And I thought that song could never come from New York. Right. Part of that whole thing is about being from, Louisiana, New Orleans, being from the deep South. Mm-hmm. And so that is like really, really important that these, New York had a hold on hip hop for a long, long time in terms of the US, and it's still the US is still, besides, France is really, Ghana's coming up, Nigeria's coming up, Cuba, but and then when the kind of real depth of performance and aesthetics and artistry, when people really said, I can do this too, I think it was a real wake-up call, for New York hip hop. But we benefited from that as listeners, you know. And think about, you know, where would we be if we didn't have Juvenile? We would have, you know, Lil Wayne. We wouldn't have probably Drake. We wouldn't have, you know, oh my God, Nicki Minaj in the same way, right? Even though Drake's in Toronto, Nicki Minaj is from Queens, that you know, No Limit, the whole No Limit Soldier just gave us so much sonically and visually and imaginatively. So anyway, this is just to say, I think, like, you know, paying attention to the regional sound and the regional kind of, you know, the people who are influencing those artists, because the artists are kind of like, it's like that saying people used to say, like, the best players, basketball players, are not in the NBA, you know, they're like playing in some court, you know, somewhere, you know, some pickup game. It's similar with like artists, you know, a lot of the people who make it aren't necessarily the best, even though they're talented, but they're the ones who are kind of they're kind of letting us know, they're kind of pointing us toward the algorithm, you know? And so I think that's another reason to kind of like get deeper into the regional, you know, context.
Yeah, I mean, my mind, this is a comment, but like where my mind just went is thinking about sort of New York and New Orleans and the Bay Area. I'm thinking about these, like the kind of sort of uniqueness around these areas and their contributions to hip hop, and how, as you kind of point out, right, the way in which you frame, like, there are certain unique qualities of New York that produce a particular kind of queer hip hop. And I think we see that in places like New Orleans as well. We definitely see it in places like the Bay as well. Right. And so, like, for me, it's like thinking about the kind of conversations that kind of exist as you know, the circulation of bodies and ideas that can only happen in these kind of port cities, right? In these kinds of areas where there's a lot of kind of, where there's trade and also trade, right? So the way that,
release your trade. Big Frida told us to release our trade.
But this is that's where my mind is starting to go now. So it's like, for me, it's just like what you're saying is just is definitely on point. But to actually talk about Big Frida and release the trade, one of the things that is to actually talk about the kind of contemporary moment, right? Which, as you know, lots of stuff happening around queer hip hop, right?
Yeah.
And you know, your book is, you know, you end on talking about this kind of contemporary moment, but you also want us to kind of like not forget this past, right? That's kind of what's also happening in the book, which obviously is super important. But I do want to ask you, like, what are your kind of thoughts around the scene right now, as I'll say this, as a scholar and also as a performer?
This is such a wild moment. I feel like in some ways we're just like on the frontier in so many ways. I mean, you know, the context, it's really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about the 80s. I mean, I have some nostalgia because I was a child. So, but I remember Reagan being elected and the kind of, my mom voted for Carter and my dad voted for Reagan, and the fights that they had, right? And how polarizing that was and how scary that moment was. You know, it was still Cold War. I thought, you know, for those of you old enough, it was like hiding under the desk. I don't know how that was going to stop a nuclear bomb from killing us, but doing these like nuclear war, you know, I was really into films like War Games and Red Dawn, not the remake. And the music was so important. And part of it was that music was coming from, and, you know, the context, right? AIDS, crack, coming out of the gas crisis, war, you know, war everywhere. We're at war, we're doing all this stuff. And it was such a wild time, but it was also, the imagination was so free, and also technology was speeding up. It was like, just in that decade, we started having personal computers, you know, it's like cable blew up, like just people were getting individually more adept at technology. And so I think that this moment it's reminding me of it with the kind of economic and global chaos, and how much fascism is back in fashion. you know, and it's not, you know, a lot of times I think when I've read, you know, read history books or think about fascism, it's always presented as this kind of top down, like evil leader. But fascism is really like, people agree to that. They're like, yes, I want that, you know, and that's the thing that's really kind of scary. And so it's the music, the art. Okay, the art that we're getting out of this moment is really amazing, partly because it's a way to push back. And I think, you know, when Beyonce released You Won't Break My Soul, and people were like, house music is back, as if it ever went away. But I think in terms of needing music that offers us opportunities for liberation. So if anyone's a house head, house music is like, that's liberatory music. You know, that is freedom. It is utopic. It is one of the things also interesting about house music is if you ever go to a house concert, the age range is like, you know, higher, and people are dancing, you know, they are getting down. And there's something about house music and its queer qualities, potentialities, and artists and audience that I think, and also it's Black, right? It's Black music, and it invites people in. So house music has a quality that hip hop used to have, which was everyone's welcome. Hip hop, somewhere along the way, I blame New York for this, but also basically the East Coast, West Coast war for this. Hip hop, the people who make money off of music saw that by investing in the authenticity narrative, they can make a lot more money by pushing that narrative. And so, because there was really nothing like it. I mean, there was punk, but punk has always pretty much been subterranean. You know, it's had little moments of going, you know, you get Green Day, right? You know, and then they have to water things down, or you have, you know, what would you categorize Rage Against the Machine? They're like hip hop, punk, metal. You have moments with groups like that kind of, but as a scene, they take over they don't like, it's not a zeitgeist moment. So I think house music is like, everyone's welcome, come in, you know, and I think that's really important. And I hope more hip hop artists embrace using house music. I mean, some do, because a lot of people have been working with like Black Coffee. I don't know if people know him, the DJ, South African DJ. And I mean, Drake, that was where Get It Together was a Black Coffee song. And so Drake just kind of remade it. And so I think in terms of hip hop proper, I mean, I listen to a lot of contemporary hip hop music. I mean, I hate to sound like one of these people who's like stuck in the 90s or whatever, but you know, I have a particular thing that I like. So I like boom bap hip hop. I just like, you know, I like drum and bass, and I also like very intellectual, wordy, you know. So I like J. Cole, you know, I like wordplay, I like storytellers. I'm not really into like, I mean, drill music is fine, but it's like, I like lo-fi, you know, so I'm into lyrics. And so in terms of what I want to listen to, party music, I can listen to anything, but so I'm like, ugh, snooze, whatever, loud music. But then I get turned on to some really good stuff. So I think like where I'm seeing queerness, I know people are like Lil Nas X or even like Young M.A., which I'm starting to make an argument about Young M.A. I'm writing a little piece where Elliott, Lauren, and I are going to be in a panel, hopefully, where I'm saying that although Young M.A. is a lesbian, is a stud, she is not queer. Like, there's nothing queer about Young M.A., right? But I would say like fashion is actually a place where I think just the obsession with fashion is really interesting. High fashion, right? The obsession with like the art world. And I'm still not totally clear what that means. I think it has different resonances for like Black men in hip hop, right, than like maybe, you know, white men. But it's like, I'm like looking up at this picture of Jay-Z right in front of me. But I'm like, you know, people like being at the Balenciaga show, which was amazing, by the way, but being at the Balenciaga show, or I went to see Virgil Abloh's a talk on Virgil Abloh. You know, he was a creative director at Louis Vuitton, but also he made Off-White, and it was just interesting. It was all these people who were obviously into hip hop and fashion, you know? And so there's something there that is being expressed visually or through clothing or through just through interacting with fashion brands that is, you know, like just how Telfar is like blown up and everyone has their Telfar bags, right? And people are obsessed with Telfar. So I think there's something really interesting happening around fashion. And you know, not a lot of people write about hip hop fashion, you know, and that's beyond my, you know, wheelhouse and skill set, but that's something that I just observe as someone who's interested in fashion, and as someone who looks at how hip hop artists adorn themselves. There's like a real, shift in adornment, you know, and really, and that harkens back to the 90s, right? With like Diplo and Pink and the earrings and, you know, all the bling and being really, you know, and seeing how that, so that's what I would say, you know, it would be nice if there was, you know, I think the music, people a lot of times blame it on hip hop, you know, hip hop's homophobic, but it's really the music industry is so conservative, you know, it's just like, I mean, gays sell, like there's not, it's not a question anymore. Gay, I just got the George Michael book, you know, and it's like gays sell, you know, that's not a question anymore, but there's something about the music industry. I don't know if it's like, you know, the sexual availability of the pop star, right? That fantasy that people have to sell, like the sexual availability of Beyonce, even though we know she's unattainable to all of us, but there's like that. So maybe that's part of it, but it's not the gays. We sell, you know. Now, if you go to television, we're everywhere. We're everywhere. So I think this is an interesting moment where, you know, music hasn't really caught up. The music industry hasn't really caught up with what people want. You know, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, those are very queer generations and seem to get queerer each generation. You know, the queering and transing of those generations, some people think that's bad, but I think that is just indicative of more people understanding they have more freedom around their, you know, bodily autonomy, you know, unless the, you know, courts and the legislature tells us differently. So that was a lot, but that's what I think about, you know, and again, that's also how it's kind of that rhizomatic quality is how I really think about hip hop culture and performance, right? And then I'm like, well, what am I interested in writing about? What conundrum do I have? What questions do I have? What catches my attention?
No, this was fantastic. I'm like trying to monitor time because I like have one last question, but I don't know if Francesca,
I'll try to make it quick. I'll try to make it quick.
Okay. I mean, so, okay. I lied. So I do have one question, but I'm going to ask two.
Such an academic.
But I mean, it goes into everything that you just said. We haven't had a chance to talk about the title of the book. So it's about the title of the book, but also the cover of the book.
Okay.
And heresies and heretics and why that becomes important to you, right? You already talked a little bit about authenticity, right? In your response to the previous question, but like when we think about fashion and we think about queer hip hop and fashion, I think about it as a kind of heretical thing as well. So like there's a way that that for me, you've given me language to think about queerness and hip hop differently through this language of heresy. So I wanted to hear more about this, but since we're talking about the title of the book, if you can also
I will tie it
into the cover.
So I would poster. I was imagining when I was writing the dissertation, I was imagining, I think the dissertation was called Heresies, hip hop, Heresies of hip hop or something. It was like slightly different. And I was thinking like, what if just like I went up to a hip hop head and was like, you know, queer, and they'd be like, whatever. And so I was like, oh, this is like heretical. This is against the standard, the orthodox story. And so I was like, oh, this is like, you know, heterodoxy. This is, and I was thinking about, well, from heresy, we get new stories, you know, and that's part of being literate, is like you get to read and interpret and create new narratives. And so I really was like, oh yeah, these are like, I'm a heretic, right? And this is heretical to a certain kind of commitment to a story. And so one of the things is there are many genealogy stories, right? And so I think that that's really important. If you told the history of hip hop from the perspective of the women who were there, right? There was just a panel I saw, the two Sylvias, about Sylvia Robinson and Sylvia Rhone, two of the most, without Sylvia Robinson, we wouldn't have had Rappers Delight, right? She put together that boy band, right? We wouldn't have had a hip hop hit and selling 2 million units in 1979, right? And then Sylvia Rhone's just incredible, and you know, with the Roots and all these different people. So if you told that history through all the early hip hop, early rappers, all the party organizers, you know, all the people who encouraged their brothers and uncles to do that, throw these parties, you'd have a totally different history, and people are starting to do that. So I'm waiting for, you know, that scholarly book on, you know, women, you know, the history of women in hip hop in terms of that. So I think that's one of the things. Okay, the cover. So I was saying earlier before we started recording, there's some gay drama. So like 5 years ago, I found the cover, not this cover. And I saw it on an artist page. And I said, that's the cover of my book. It was an incredible collage. And then when it came time to pick out the cover, I told the press, I had written in my contract, I was like, I have final say on the cover. So they were like, we love it, all approved. In, what's this, November, I get a DM on Instagram from someone that says, do you have permission to use this image for your book? No, you don't. And then the person was like, look, I realized actually it's the artist. So the person who's DM'd me was the rapper Lif, or known as Mix Khalif now. And I was like, what? And the artist had made a collage using Mix Khalif's image from a Condé Nast magazine. So I said, well, we're not going to do that. And it was an incredible image. I mean, I can't even, I'll email it to you or text it to you, Elliott, later. And I said, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I knew I wanted a Black artist. And I asked some of my friends who are visual artists, and nothing quite fit. We found a kind of, I thought what would work from someone who I'm writing about for my next book, Keon Williams. And then the press rejected it. And so finally, I found this is by an artist, Quirky, who's out of Baltimore, QRCKY. I followed him on Instagram, and one day I just started going through all these Black artists' pages on Instagram. And someone maybe had given me a list, but I had already followed him, and I knew I liked images that I had seen of his, and they weren't quite right. And I go down, and this piece is called Man in Gold. And I saw it and I thought, that's it. And there was something about it that it kind of speaks to the, you know, there's obviously the gold part, the hat, it's obviously like a Black man's face, but there's also all the different coloring and all the texture. And I felt like it got at both the kind of ways that Black men and Black people in general are seen as kind of both producers of cultural wealth, but also kind of obscured. But also it got that, to me, there's a kind of melancholy to it as well. So I asked Quirky, and he was like, hell yeah. And that, yeah. And so one of the things that reminded me was that there's never just one thing, you know. I thought, oh, there'll never be a cover that felt this perfect, but this feels, I can't imagine another cover now, you know. So yeah, and one of the things that's really nice, and I'm hoping to have a conversation with Quirky at some point, as I would love to just talk to him about his art, but it's been really amazing to just get to know him a little bit through, I know that doesn't always happen, but just to get to know him a little bit through the use of his art. And, you know, so he likes my posts and I try to tag him, you know, and so, yeah, it really feels like this cover is like, besides the name, is like people, someone told me they were reading on the subway and people were like stopping them. And I think, you know, it's because this cover, you know? And so I feel like that is a true success, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect cover. Like I'm interested to see the other image, but like I remember when you unveiled the cover, I don't know if it was on social media, I think, and I was like, it's a gorgeous color, like everything about it. And as you said, like the colors, but everything works really, really well together.
Yeah, I gasped when I saw. I was like, oh, I'm crying. You know, I mean, I just want to say to people who haven't written a book, it's hard. I mean, I cried when I finished with a damn media stupid thing they make you do with all the marketing, and oh god, it's awful. And when I got the blurbs, you know, from Alex Mahellier and Cynthia Young, I was like weeping. And when I got the proofs, and when I held it in my hands, when I signed it, you know, in some stores. So it's been really emotional. So anyway, there are questions to be asked by the audience. So thank you.
This is such a great conversation and such great flow. We've got a ton of questions. So, but first, Carl is reminding me, Shanté, if you can give your discount code link for NYU, that would be awesome if you have a chance. And kind of maybe connected to the melancholy with the glimmer of the cover that you're just describing. Terrence's question is partly about kind of reconciling homophobia with queer enthusiasm for the genre. Terrence, do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm a fan of hip hop from the 90s, and I realize obviously there has been an evolution in terms of lyrics and how queer positive the lyrics have gotten, but there's a lot of queer spaces where we listen to music that that contradicts our identity or that is homophobic, quite frankly. So I was just curious to know if you addressed that in the book. I didn't get a chance to read the whole introduction.
I mean, I think in part that's what I talk about a little bit in the last chapter about queer hip hop. And particularly that's something that if you watch Pick Up the Mic, that's something that Tim and West talks about, like being in the club and then all of a sudden, you know, he's hearing homophobic lyrics, but you're like, I love this song or whatever. And you're like, you know, and so I think that tension is, you know, is throughout, let's say, broadly popular culture, but also, I mean, I remember a moment, I don't know if people remember this, going to clubs, and you know, I'm a club kid. I was sneaking into clubs at like 12 years old, like Fun House, and I don't know how they would let us in, and Sound Factory and all these places. And like, but I was definitely, remember going like the early 2000s, where there was a real battle in a lot of Black gay clubs around whether or not to play R. Kelly. And so people, DJs, queer women DJs would put on R. Kelly, and people would be like, boo, fuck you, like take it off. And they'd be like, fuck you, I'm not. And I mean, so that was like, so I feel like that's part of the conversation, is like, do you play R. Kelly? Do you play Michael Jackson? Do you play, you know, homophobic music? Do you play, you know, Beanie Man? I mean, they've all been like, they all redeemed themselves. They're, oh, I'm not homophobic anymore. But like, you know, part of it's like, you know, that's part of the what comes, right? And the other thing about like homophobia is, I think also about the other things. Like I think a lot about the like drug stuff, like the killing, and I'm like, you know, there's a lot of fucked up shit, like shooting someone in the head. I don't know. I'm just like, you know, so sometimes that, you know, I think for me over time, I think a lot about what I'm listening to and what I'm taking in. I think, you know, when I was a teenager, there was some, you know, it was like listening to Biggie and Jay and whoever, when they were in their kind of, you know, thug. I was never really a Tupac fan, I'm sorry to say, but in their thug phases, I know it's Nas, whatever. And And I'm like, do I want to kidnap a baby? Like, why am I like, why am I listening to why, so there's a lot to be, thought about, right? In terms of what am I listening to, And so for me, it's not just about homophobia, even though that's part of it, but it's also like about the internalized anti-Blackness that gets, that we get paid to popularize, right? And that produces a kind of idea that, there's like nihilistic, Blackness, but that's part of the machinery, right? Is like, that's what sells, right? And who's that selling to, right? So I think people have evolved. One of the things I want to say that I didn't say in the book, because I wasn't also sure what I could get away with, who would come after me, right? Is thinking about all these hip hop artists that have queer parents, like Jay-Z, Snoop Dogg, 50 Cent. And so some of that, I don't want to be too like biographical or too psychoanalytic, but some of that has to do with, or, who just made Kendrick Lamar, that damn song with it's the most terrible trans. He used to be my uncle used to be a woman. I'm like, Kendrick, no, just leave it alone. So like, I think some of this has to do with, there's an image of like Black people being more homophobic, but we have so many queer people in our families. And I think that tension between the family, the cousin, the whatever, the mother, the father, and the image of tough, cool, together Black man artist, hip hop artist, at odds, right? So that tender part gets like erased, and we end up with a lot of, rage.
Antonia, you had a question about geography and New Orleans in particular.
What's up, y'all? I feel like what's up? I feel like Elliott and Shanté kind of got at that when they're talking about how region shapes the sorts of music that has more possibilities to be openly queer. So New Orleans, Sissy Bounce, where that was a moment and continues to be a moment where people are queer subculture around hip hop, and queer and hip hop is not at odds there.
Right.
Can I ask another question instead, friends? Jessica, can you talk a little bit about the queerness of street culture in and of itself? I mean, graffiti is a legal thing to do, and you run around tagging walls and whatever, and you're queer, and you're hanging out with all kinds of folks breaking the law, and there's a way in which there's an unexamined queerness, under recognized queerness of street culture to begin with, and hip hop is as a street inflected culture is picking up on that. But I've been thinking a lot about the queerness of street culture, and any thoughts that you have about that.
That's really beautiful. I mean, I would defer to maybe to Jessica Pabon's book, Graffiti Girls, thinking more about because I know she talks a lot with a lot of the women and girls in that book about some of whom were queer and some of who hadn't thought about it like that. But I think you're right. Again, my mind is going right back to the 80s. I'm rewatching Stranger Things. This is part of it. And I'm remembering, I'm like, oh, I was one of, like just being a latchkey kid, just meeting up with random people. I'm thinking about like myself as a teenager and how we go on these little road trips and like make out with random people. And that was like, just kind of being destructive and shoplifting and meeting people who were like traveling across the country and I don't know, living in vans. And I do think, I'm like, that I do think that like, yeah, there's an inherent queerness there that has to do with like kind of, I don't want to, this is not utopian because it can go left, but a lot of the social rules and boundaries come down. And so I think that also that has to do with, who you fuck and, or what you're introduced to or what's possible. And there are some elements of exploration there that can come when you're in a kind of like subcultural space. one of the early articles I saw, like from the 80s, it was talking about a concert on one of the piers in like 1981, and it was The Clash, Curtis Blow, and Gregory Isaacs. So you have punk, hip hop, and dance hall. That would never happen today. And so I think that's part of it. Was those were all kind of like street cultural, out of the way, in the know music scenes that I would totally go to that concert, you know, that were attracting the same kinds of people, like countercultural freaks, people who were interested in having experiences that were being, taken from them. So I do think like there is a kind of, gang, of course, hip hop coming from gang culture. The other side of that is like there's a lot of abuse. I mean, I talk about that a little bit with African Bambaataa. So on one side, there's like homophobia. On the other side, there's sexual assault, right? And so it's like an entanglement that's wrapped up in patriarchy. And so so there's like these possibilities, and it can go kind of dark, or it can be more liberatory. And I do, I'm really excited to see what you're gonna in your next book talk about this. But I do think that the elements, I don't say too much if anything about it. I think prison culture also has a huge influence on. There used to be a project, community-based organization in New York that would specifically work with folks whose sexuality and or gender had changed in prison. And they would help people kind of transition out of prison, now as like queer and or trans people. And I'm like, what? And so I think like that's also a big part of, because of the incarceration rates of Black men and women and people, that's a big part of the whisper conversation around hip hop, is that it's, so much of hip hop culture is influenced not only by prison culture, but by gangsters. They literally control some of these rappers, right? And so a lot of them now are wearing colors, and Crips, Bloods, or whatever. And so there's still a very strong connection with underground economies and street culture and illicit, which I think is a part of why it's interesting.
Okay, let's see. Arya had a comment. We had a lot of great conversation, which I know you're going to want to check out. But Charles Thompson had a question about the language of queer. Would you like to ask that, Charles?
Yeah, hi. So I know that it's a little bit off topic, and it's not necessarily your job to sort of, I guess, clarify what you mean when you refer to young MA as not being queer per se. And I'm just curious what goes into that analysis.
Yes, I mean, it's very nascent, so please feel free to push back on it. But I'm thinking about, queer as more disruptive, right? Experimental, non-normative, playful. Did I already say experimental? So young MA ain't that. So young MA's masculinity is like, it's like a copy paste of like the dudes. And that's also a particular Black gender, the stud, right? The Black stud. And it's very, like if you want to know more about that, you could like look at the film The Aggressives, right? Which is about Black stud, a documentary about Black stud culture. And that's very much, it differs then sort of from Jack Halberstam's like female masculinity insofar as like it's a Black gender, but it also has to do with a kind of normative, misogynistic Black masculinity. right? So it's like you fuck bitches, you get money, you get high, you shoot up N-words. It's just there's not, as far as I can tell, you know, Young MA, at least visually, sonically, is not interested in making any kind of queer overtures, LGBT community type things. She is really successful in terms of mainstream. She's one of the guys, right? When you go to her website, however, there is this portion where she's like selling like Tomboy X like binders, and that's where it's queer. Like straight women and straight dudes aren't wearing binders, you know? So it's like, so it's interesting. It's like on the website is like, right, the dildo line. So, but it's so interesting. It's like, okay, the website is like, I don't know, it's like the OnlyFans. I don't know, maybe I should like see if she has an OnlyFans. But in terms of like the videos and the music, it's very much like, there's no, like Young Thug, I know he's in the RICO case right now, but Young Thug is like more queer to me than Young MA, right? In terms of pushing against sort of a kind of normative expectation. And in another way, Young MA is really great because she is a straight up stud, blunt smoking, tattoo on necks. There's no like, oh, I'm, you know, am I not? I am, you know, I am a big old homosexual. There's like a really cute picture of her Instagram of her in a football uniform at like 8 or 9 years old. And she was like, I was a little boy, you know? So I'm interested in thinking about that as like, in conversation with Black feminism and like how not every kind of LGBTQ identity is actually queer, you know? And I think that's, you know, in terms of like disruptive and this comes up a lot more in terms of transsexual, you know, folks and around like them being like, no, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I am not, you know, I'm not queer, I'm not playing with gender. And so I think that that's interesting to keep that, important to keep that part of the conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. There are a couple of questions both from Tyler, Ashley, and Carl about spaces and locations and the particular textures of New York City in the 80s and queerness. Should we hear first if Tyler or Ashley want to jump in and then maybe hear from Carl?
I don't have as much of a question. So I mean, it was just, the discussion was reminding me of an interview with Tom Silverman that I had listened to where he was talking about a prominent hip hop club that was shut down after a confrontation between hip hoppers and queer disco dancers. So I think Carl had more of a formed question, but I don't know if Ashley did either. So I just want to ping pong away from me.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I guess mine is kind of building off of Tyler's point, and I was actually thinking more about the kind of early 1970s, and so kind of in many ways like a precursor to your question, Tyler. Thinking about DJs that at the time would have been kind of playing disco or kind of occupying spaces, playing merengue or other kinds of like Latin music in different areas, but then would like make their way over to kind of these urban community spaces and playing kind of like hip hop in community. And I think a lot about that kind of juxtaposition, right? Of kind of being in these nightclub scenes with disco and Latin music. I'm thinking specifically of an interview I did a couple of years ago now with DJ Charlie Chase, where he mentioned kind of like this disco DJ team, Tom and Jerry, that used to play kind of in 74, 75. And then the way that the folks would meet and they would exchange information about kind of like their turntables and things like that. And so how we can kind of see the kind of interactions even back into the 1970s of kind of a queering of spaces and these aesthetics that you've talked about thus far.
Yeah, there was a lot of really cool experimentation. I mean, I listened to, Man Parrish has like 5 seasons on YouTube. I don't know, it was a lot. And also, but he has a really great interview he did in Harvard college radio a number of years ago. And he talks a lot about the experimentation and, what people were calling what he was doing hip hop, but it was really, we might call that electro, now. And so to Tyler's point, there was a lot of conflict between disco. People were trying to push disco out. So the disco, well, let me first say, disco clubs wouldn't play that early hip hop music. So when people would turn on like Chic's Good Times, but then it would be Rapper's Delight, they'd be like, boo, no. So that, you like Nile Rodgers has a nice interview where he talks about that. And so there was this conflict, but then, rap music eventually kind of won out. But for many years, I mean, even into maybe, now, because no hip hop, no rap music, So a lot of the queer clubs that I used to go to were really hesitant, unless you went to the Octagon, where I hope someone's writing about Octagon Warehouse. And those, and then later Escuelita, so it'd be hip hop, house, Latin, Caribbean. So you had to go to specific Crazy Nanny. So you had to go to specific clubs that were welcoming. This in New York, and then there was that. There used to be that Black lesbian party in the Bay that was called like Red or something. That was a hip hop party. So we had to find our own spaces as like Black queer folks that would play hip hop and house music and R&B and, reggae. So we weren't necessarily welcome in white LGBTQ clubs, or gay clubs, I should say. We weren't welcome in those clubs. So you see a lot of the Black gay clubs were on specific nights. They didn't have like necessarily every day. So we go to the Bronx, to the Warehouse, in this really sketchy, I was under a bridge and near I don't know what, but we did it. And so those were those safe havens. But there was definitely this conflict in the club spaces themselves around what music and what people they wanted in those spaces. It's, so yeah.
Carl, do you want to jump in with your question?
I think in the interest of time, because these things were all sort of overlapping, that you should move on so we can fit in more people.
Okay. And can you save the chat too? Because this is so good.
Yeah, we'll send it to you after.
Okay, great. I also put the discount code in the chat.
Awesome. Okay. Gus had a question about archives. I was thinking about this too.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. It sounds amazing. And I guess this is kind of a nerd question, but just curious to hear you talk a little bit about just archives and some of the specific archives that went into the book, and what you found challenging or surprising about them, and negotiating between different kinds of archives. I think I'm kind of asking you about queer method and archive. So yeah, just anything that sparks.
Yeah, this is, I'm a big archive nerd. I really like digging in dusty books and hours and hours and hours to find a couple of things. But the archive really helped me write this book. I think because all of these objects and people and scenes were so exciting to me. They were so quirky and weird. The Last Dragon, if y'all haven't seen it, it's such a weird movie of its time, but it also, I think it sort of holds up, and it's problematic, but also really funny. And I, it's, as I say, this I felt was the biggest realization I had. I was like, oh, this is a piece of fan fiction, this movie. So I think and Jean Grey, and of course then this queer hip hop archive, I just felt like they were so rich. It was so easy for me to fall into the stories and put together a narrative, right? that was compelling. And I think for me, because I really loved or fell in love with all of these artists, it made it somewhat, it made the writing somewhat more lucid for me. It didn't feel like a struggle conceptually. It was a struggle to physically write because writing is challenging for me, but it felt like the archives really spoke to me, if you will, and that I felt like I wanted to put these objects and subjects and movements in a more, bring them to the fore a little bit more. What's interesting about writing things over a long time is, in the interim, Martin Wong has there are 4 art books now about him. There was 1 when I first started writing about him. There've been big, retrospectives about his work. And so that's really great. And The Last Dragon had its 30th anniversary or whatever. So I think, Jean Grey has switched trajectories 72 times. So, and queer hip hop is mainstream, but I think for me, I really felt like this was a love letter to these, I don't know, lost moments or something. And I think that in terms of queer methods, I really felt like putting putting visual art, film, music, and kind of the last one was kind of ethnographic / historiography together was part of the queer method. I wanted to show the heterogeneity of it. I wanted to show the breadth. I wanted to show breadth in terms of, more than just rap music. And I wanted to think of, it was one was performance studies or psychoanalytic or Black feminism, visual culture. And I just feel like I pulled in all the tools that I had. And part of it was an undoing of my grad training, which was I was trained in psychoanalysis and performance studies and blah, blah, blah. And I was well, I don't want to just apply that to everything. I want to really stretch myself. And so there was a playful quality, and I tried to just have fun. Honestly, I tried to have fun. I tried to make it a party. I tried to imagine, I tried to just let my love and respect for these artists come through, and really think about ways to present. And part of that also was how I wrote it. I wanted to write it so that it could be legible. Apparently, I sent my grandmother 2 copies of the book, a hardcover and a softcover. And my brothers told me last week that she read them both cover to cover already. She's 96. So if my 96-year-old grandmother, who's hip hop, what's that? She doesn't know she doesn't know who these people are. I wanted it to be something that people could dig into. It was almost you were there, So that's part of the methodology is what's available to make it the most lucid and coherent it could be.
We have a question from Miles and from Laura Lee. Shanté, do you feel like you have a little more?
I do. I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good.
Miles, do you want to jump in with your questions? You had 2 actually about genre and also the white ear or white expectations.
Yes. Hi.
Hi,
Shanté.
Miles.
Hey. I also go back to to NYU American Studies / Performance Studies.
Yes.
Whatever we were doing.
Whatever we were doing a lot. Whatever it was, we were doing it.
But it's so great to see you and to be here for this. I have a kind of recurring question. It seems to me that these genre labels that we have, R&B, hip hop, gospel, but even the subgenres, right? Have I think about Guthrie Ramsey's book a lot, and it just feels like there are places where you can walk by and when you hear the music, you already know whether you're welcome there or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just curious if you could talk about hip hop as a genre and what its expectations are in a kind of changing way around gender expression, around sexuality, and especially with attention to sort of when the white audience gets big. because I wonder
Yeah.
if there's a change and maybe a hardening of gender expression in hip hop when, you know, white suburban, you know, folks, kids, you know, get super invested.
Wow. That's a great set of questions. I mean, I don't know. I'm going to think of it as contemplations because I don't have an answer, but this is what I will say. I've been thinking about, particularly going back to the question of genre, and I've been thinking about, I mean, you know, keep in mind what I said about the specificity of region, but I've been thinking about the lineage of Black music in the US, the same way we might think of like Black letters, you know, Black literature. And in particular, that's come up because of the way that hip hop artists over time, not just now, experiment with generic sounds, right? So I'm, you know, basically when in the last 2 years, when I asked my students who their favorite hip hop artists are, say Kanye, I roll, Kanye, Drake, and then they'll be like, you know, young boy, NBA. I'm like, okay, I don't know who that is, but whatever. And that's why I say, oh, do you listen to, you know, do you listen to all of Kanye? Yeah, all of Kanye. Do you listen to Sunday Service? What's that? I was like, wait a minute. I was like, hold on. So one of the things I see is that this is a rough, you know, it's anecdotal, but young white listeners, men usually, but also sometimes women, usually just listen to hip hop, rap music as a solitary musical genre, right? So they don't listen to R&B, which I don't know how you can listen to hip hop and not R&B. They don't know any of the soul, funk influences. They don't listen to gospel music. And I said, well, you can't understand rap music without listening to all of Black music. And all of music out of the United States is Black music. You know, for Jessica's book about countries coming out, you know, rock and roll, right? Before it became rock music, rock and roll, we know, you know, country, jazz. So there's an interesting thing where there's I was saying this again when I was talking to someone about Stranger Things, like if you were alive in the 80s, the references, the visual references in the show will have different resonances for you than if you were born in the last 20 years. And I think it's similar for rap music. If your ear is attuned to other genres, you can hear them, right? Because, you know, especially people like Questlove or Kanye, Timbaland, you know, Ninth Wonder, you know, they're Q-Tip, they were like Jay Dilla, they're listening to everything. And so the expanse and, you know, Black music and beyond. So the expansiveness of that is very important, you know. So rap music is like it's an amalgam. I mean, and now it's, you know, it's almost all sample based. So it definitely is. And I do this thing sometimes where I'll listen to, and I sometimes do this as an assignment where I'll listen to a song and then I'll tell my students they have to go to Who Sample to see what the samples are, and then they have to listen to all the songs. So the other day I was listening to, I didn't realize, this shows you my limit, I didn't realize that, what's the song? Who Can I Run To that Escape did in 1985 was the Jones Girls in 1978. And I was like, so I was listening to the differences, and I think there's something important about understanding those differences and connections and hearing how music changes over time, but also hearing some of the through lines. And so I think what gets lost is like when you just like think of like hip hop as a meal rather than as like a part of a larger sonic landscape. I don't know if when, you know, hip hop becomes when any kind of like even subgenre becomes like uber pop. I mean, it's hard to say because like there have been hip hop from rap music from the very beginning was popular, but not necessarily in the US. So it was a global success right from the start. And I think, you know, maybe by the time you get to 1984, particularly with movies, 1985, and then, you know, McDonald's is doing commercial, 1986, and you're getting things like Run DMC doing, you know, Aerosmith, you're getting those kinds of things. Eric Clapton is suing, I think, Run DMC for using a sample from the Byrds. Then I don't know. It's hard to say like chicken, egg, what comes first. But I think what happened, at least when corporations had more control over music, is that they're definitely telling artists what kind of sound to make, for sure. I mean, you hear artists talk about this all the time. They're saying, I mean, not just hip hop artists, right? They're saying, no, you can't do that. No, that's too weird. No, we're trying to market that. And I think, like I said before, a very one-dimensional Black masculinity, just like it's like the same thing when you talk to Black actors, the roles they play. It's the same thing in terms of, popular music. So it's very one-dimensional in terms of corporate concerns controlling that imagery. So I like this idea of you saying, if you're welcome by the sounds. And I feel like I know what kinds of conversations I can have with people by what they like listen to. And I'm like, just as a little anecdote, there was a thing on Instagram that was apparently Lil Wayne was at, it was talking about how Black men love Anita Baker. And then Lil Wayne was at Anita Baker concert. And I was like, Black men love Anita Baker. Like that's, and you wouldn't think of Lil Wayne as an Anita Baker listener, but of course he is, right? That's his mom played Anita Baker cleaning on Saturdays, just like all of our moms. You turn on Anita Baker, you turn on the gospel music. It's time to clean the house. So I think that also then disrupts it does. It's like obviously Lil Wayne is a troubling figure in some ways, but he listened to Anita Baker, and so I think that nuances some of this idea about like what hip hop is and what hip hop's influences are. It's definitely soul music. It's definitely people like Anita Baker and Tina Marie and Luther Vandross that have deep resonances for, a lot of hip hop artists.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I love that. Shanté, I think we're right at time. So, and the chat, such a great conversation that's been happening on and offline. But thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And thanks to everybody for being here today.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Elliott. And thank you, everyone. Yeah,
Thank you.
in the chat.
Elliott. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah.